This is the Paddletek TKO-C 14.3mm paddle and probably one of the most powerful legal paddles currently still on the market. And in my opinion, it's also probably one of the few paddles out there that could comfortably replace the Gen 3s for all you power addicts out there. Anyways, please consider subscribing if you enjoy, and let's jump into things. Alright, so this is a $229 raw carbon fiber surface paddle with a honeycomb center and also Christian Alshon's signature paddle. It has a slightly lighter average weight of 8 ounces, a width of 7.5 inches, and thanks to its elongated shape, a length of 16.5 inches. It also has a grip length of 5.25 inches, which is the shorter handle version of this paddle. The TKO-CX version has a longer 5.75 inch grip length, but honestly, in my opinion, the 5.25 inch handle has plenty of room still to get a two-handed backhand on. So it really just comes down to preference. I do have small hands though. Anyways, here are some more specs if you want, and now let's just jump straight into the gameplay. Starting off with power. Now, as I mentioned before, this paddle hits hard. Not quite as hard as the Gen 3s did, but it's really not that far off. To me, this paddle feels very similar to the Perseus Gen 3 with a bit less pop and power, but the trade-off is it has way more control, but we'll get into that in a bit. Still, drives, volleys, serves, anything where you want to hit the ball hard, it'll get the job done. Just moving from using the Ruby, a pretty well-rounded paddle, to this, I could instantly see a substantial difference in power in my game without changing anything. Now again, it isn't quite on par with the power of the Gen 3s or even some of the other power paddles out there like the Gearbox Pro, but it is still top tier and definitely hits harder than most paddles on the market. It's also equally as impressive when you realize that Paddletek was able to get this much power in this without thermoforming or using foam injections like a lot of new paddles out there. One random downside when using this thing though is this thing is loud as fuck, especially when you hit hard, which it's a power paddle, so that's kind of gonna happen. I kind of got used to it the longer I played with it, but it really does catch you off guard the first few times you hit with it. Now, the pop on this thing is actually pretty crazy. Again, it's not as crazy as the Gen 3s, but honestly, in my opinion, that's a good thing. The Gen 3s were so poppy that it was borderline impossible to use because it was so unpredictable and always just launched so hard off the surface even when you didn't want it to. But the pop on the TKO-C is actually fairly consistent while still being strong. It really made it so when I hit the ball right, I barely had to put any effort into the volleys or counters. The word right being key though, which I'll get into in a sec. I will say it did take some time to get used to the power and pop on this, probably longer than your average paddle. When I first started using it, I hit a lot of balls out of bounds before I was able to dial things in. But after you get more reps with this thing, it got a lot easier and quickly became a lot more comfortable to use. Overall for power though, I would give this an 8.5 out of 10. All right, now on to control, the surprisingly underrated part of this paddle. So I have to say, initially, when I first used this paddle, the control felt like shit. I still remember picking it up for the first time weeks ago and feeling like everything that came off of this paddle was so unpredictable, and things like drops or even drives were really hard to hit consistently. And I think this was for a few different reasons. One, I just wasn't used to a paddle that was this poppy yet, so it took some time for me to adjust to personally. And two, I think the paddle itself actually needed to be broken into a bit because now after using the paddle weeks later, everything feels 10 times easier to control. I feel like I can consistently hit drops now, dinks feel pretty comfortable as well, and more importantly, I feel like when I hit the ball, it'll actually go where I want it to instead of just flying off and doing whatever the it wants. I seriously really am impressed though on how much control you still have with this now that it's broken in, because I really don't notice a huge difference compared to actual control paddles. It doesn't quite give you the grippy or plush feeling that control paddles give you, but I do feel really comfortable with the soft game using this, which is almost never the case when you have a paddle this strong. Overall for control though, I would give it a 7 out of 10 broken in and a 5 out of 10 out of the box. Moving on to spin. Now the spin on this paddle is actually pretty good. It's not the grittiest paddle I've come across, but it does have a solid amount on it, and more importantly, the grit has lasted better and longer than most paddles have. I mean, after a paddle has been used this much, I typically start to see a noticeable change on the grit, but honestly, not much has changed. In fact, there's enough left still that it kind of hurts even just dragging my hand across it. Anyways, the extra grit of course allows you to get a solid amount of spin on the ball, and that combined with the power really makes this a fun paddle to drive with. Even if you hit the ball way too high, if you use enough topspin, it'll probably still stay in due to the spin. Overall, I would give spin on this paddle a solid 7 out of 10. Okay, now let's talk sweet spot. The sweet spot on the TKO-C is okay. When you're driving, hitting hard, dropping, or even dinking, it actually feels pretty good. But when you block with this thing, or volley just in general, sometimes for some reason or another, it just doesn't feel good at all. And more importantly, the ball just dies. I don't know what it is about this paddle, but when it comes to defending, you can really start to feel and hear the dead spots on this thing. That said, sometimes I guess it can play to your advantage, like this block that turned into the weakest trop ever. Still, it's something to consider if you're thinking about getting this paddle. Speaking of which, here are some other cons I've noticed in this paddle as well. To start, the handle on this paddle is pretty square shaped, which is fairly standard for a lot of paddles, but for some reason, it seems a little more exaggerated with the TKO-C. Now, while this may sound like just a preference thing, it also kind of messed up some of my shots sometimes. There are some hits where I'd go to wind up my shot, but the shape of the handle made my grip slip around the sharper angles and it caused me to miss a few more shots. Again, it's kind of nitpicking here, but it's also just something to consider. I feel like an overgrip would probably help as well. Next, I have to admit the quality on this feels a bit on the cheaper side. I ran into the same issue with the Gen 3 Perseus, but it's not quite as bad as that. Still, it's slightly crazy to think that this is a $220 paddle. Also, the surface of this paddle, for some reason or another, marks really easily, as you can see, which is kind of annoying. It doesn't really affect gameplay much, but it's not something you would expect to happen. And lastly, there's of course the dead spots issue and the annoying factor of it just being ridiculously loud. Anyways, what are my final thoughts on this paddle? Well, honestly, I kind of like it more than I thought I would. I think it's definitely more expensive than it probably should be, and it does feel a bit cheaper, but so far, it does what it's meant to do. Again, also think it's really impressive how much control this paddle gives you for how powerful it is. I really don't think I can emphasize that part enough, so much so that I'm actually considering using this or something similar to this as my next main paddle. While I think this paddle is perfect for people who are more control-oriented players just looking to get more power in their game in general, I also think it's a pretty solid option for those who already have a lot of power thanks to the fact that it does have really good control too, which almost feels weird to say. I mean, I'm able to hit pretty hard with this thing and I'm not a power player, but I've also seen people who already hit hard use this and it's pretty insane, almost scary insane. It's also worth mentioning that there is a 12.7mm version of this paddle out there too, which I haven't gotten to use yet, but even without saying it, I honestly imagine it not being worth it. I just can't imagine that you would get enough benefit out of the 12.7mm version to weigh what you would probably lose in control, but I could be wrong. Anyways, that's it. If you found any of this helpful, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Peace.